Hi everyone. What I want to talk about tonight is what it takes in practical terms for you to take responsibility of your own wheelchair's maintenance. That is, coordinating it and perhaps having a friend doing this instead of hiring the local mobility store. I want to let you know that I'm making this vehicle especially for two groups of people. The first is for those who don't have coverage for their power wheelchair maintenance. The second group of people is for if you've been told you have a really high bill that's necessary to maintain your wheelchair and your gut instinct is telling you otherwise. I want to give you my feedback on how I see and what is involved with the maintenance of a power wheelchair. I do want to let you know I am using notes tonight. I don't often use notes in my videos. I have a lot to say and want to make sure I cover everything that came to mind as I planned for this video. So please bear with me if I periodically look down. Making eye contact with you is one thing that I care about. You aren't just a video to me. I realize that there's real people that this represents and there's real lives at stake. I want to help you with what I can do from here in my home and the experience that I've gained over the past decade or so using a power wheelchair. So let's dive into this, and I hope some of this will help you. Perhaps this is a video that you just watch this time, and then a second time you watch while making some notes for yourself of what's applicable for the situation you're in now. And then maybe a third time you'd watch it with a friend to begin thinking through if this is something that a friend could take responsibility for to help you out. So let's dive into this. Topic number 1 is the maintenance of the electrical system in your wheelchair. So a wheelchair has a computer that controls it. If you look at the frame of the wheelchair, it's the same. And the powered wheels don't pivot like a car. So instead, when a wheelchair is turning left or a wheelchair is turning right, one wheel gets less electricity to make the turn. So the other wheel is what is turning the wheelchair around a corner. So for a wheelchair that you're going to maintain yourself, you need to make sure that wherever the computer is located, that it's well protected from the weather. Rain, puddles on the ground, and snow. And this is essential. I tend to think that a wheelchair's computer will last long term. Like, if I get off topic for a second, I host my own websites, and the computer I'm using right now is from 1998. It works fantastic as a server, it's reliable, and I genuinely can count on it. I have that same impression about the computer that this wheelchair has. I don't expect it to die as long as responsibility is given when disconnecting the batteries and reconnecting them, as well as I said, protecting it from the weather. There are wires that go to the joystick. So, there are cords involved, and periodically a cord is going to need to be replaced. However, replacing these cords, more or less, is the same as plugging in a USB cable into a computer. It's not a huge production to do so. I do realize that in some models of wheelchairs, the cables are fished through the frame of the wheelchair with minimal exposure to the elements. I tend to think that those cables aren't going to suddenly be chafed and wear out. However, you may periodically need to replace a cable. Now, the next part of this is being able to remove the batteries and replace them. On my 4 wheelchairs, there has been a diagram right in the battery compartment showing how to do this. Also, the manuals have been readily available on the internet, giving the same information of how to change them. Where to buy new batteries for a wheelchair is straightforward and easy. You do not need to go to your local mobility store and pay an overhead price for a niche market. One of the dirty little secrets I've discovered is wheelchair batteries are sold at your big box hardware store. They would be sold at a store that deals with boat supplies and fishing, but the generic hardware store about 4 kilometers from me sells the model of batteries in here, and they're less expensive. You can get a better quality that deals with the cold from them, but overall, you aren't bound to a mobility store to buy replacement batteries. If you've got the ability to handle a wrench and understand a picture showing you how to hook the batteries up, it's not hard. I do need to tell you, though, that you should be doing so at your own risk and with extensive protection. The safety warning with this is that electricity is something to be respected. You need to know what you're doing, or you could cause a spark and potentially injure or harm yourself very seriously, including death. I don't sugarcoat things, I'm sorry. I would rather tell you straight how it is. Now, the second sort of theme is the maintenance of changing the tire treads. So that is, if your wheelchair has 2 small tires at the front and back, and then big ones in the middle, there are also wheelchairs that have only 2 big ones and 2 little ones. It depends on the decisions made at the time you were being assessed for this. So replacing these treads, honestly, it's the same as when you're doing a bike. There are bearings involved, but replacing bearings is also straightforward. I'll get to that topic in a minute. But just taking a tread off and putting a new one on is straightforward. It's undoing a few screws and then pulling apart a plastic housing, putting the new tread on, and then doing the screws up again. It's not a particularly highly specialized skill that you would go to university for. So, in terms of new treads, the sale of these aren't considered a medical device like an X-ray machine that a doctor would have to order. You don't have to be an insurance company or a mobility store to have to buy these items. The end user is able to do so. What this means is a little bit of researching online, calculating costs. You could source them at the local mobility store. But like when I buy online, I have different shipping options. And I know my wheelchair, so I can plan ahead when the batteries are going to need to be done and when the wheels are going to need to be done. And I keep track of how many kilometers I drive each day, and I have a maintenance log so I can forecast when I'm going to need to have more treads on hand to replace them. It takes a little bit of organization, and that is what you're paying for with the mobility store. But I have the ability to do it. Perhaps you may not yourself, but a personal support worker or an attendant care worker that helps you in your home with maybe your personal hygiene, your banking, or giving you insulin if you're diabetic, that could be a task they do where you just express, yesterday I went out to the bank, the grocery store, and for a coffee with a friend, and you would just know how many kilometers or miles that is, and just keep a journal with the running total. It's not high organization. The next item we have to talk about is bearing maintenance. So typically, bearings are replaced when you see the flapping motion. It's referred to as caster flutter when this is happening in your wheels, or if when you're turning the corner, a wheel stays straight when you've seen it frequently just going to the left or going to the right. So that's when you know that it's wearing or worn out. What will be helpful to you is keeping a journal of when you're doing your maintenance, so then you'll be able to record at this number of kilometers or miles I did this, and at this number of kilometers or miles maybe I had to replace the treads. If you keep track of when you were doing maintenance and what you were doing, as well as the distance you drive each day, and then keep a running total, you'll be able to use this to predict when your wheelchair will need the next bit of maintenance, and you can plan for it, because then the wheelchair stays as an asset instead of becoming a liability with an unscheduled breakdown. And I do mean this seriously. Now, I understand that for some people, it's going to be hard keeping track of this. If you've got a personal support worker or an attendant care worker, that is someone that comes into your home that either helps you with hygiene or they help you with housekeeping, maybe this is someone that you could call on to go ahead and take care of this with you, like partnering with you. Because a lot of the relationship with the mobility store is responding to a breakdown, not planning for maintenance. So it's being proactive instead of reactive. And it's something that you can take control of in your life to give you the best quality of life when one of these wheelchairs becomes your means of mobility. So bearing maintenance does take some specialty equipment to do the changes of bearings. And it doesn't require a heavy investment up front for this equipment. So there's two pieces of equipment you need when you're changing bearings. So let's start with removing the damaged bearing. I've made this bearing puller. So what it consists of is threaded rod, a nut, a washer, an anchor for cement, 2 bolt clamps, and then some epoxy to hold the bolt clamps on for added strength, some washers, and a nut. It's really easy to make one of these. I've got a video posted on how to do this. So changing it is really straightforward. What you would do is take your bearing puller and putting it underneath like that, like you're going to sew. And then in this space will be the stem bearing housing. So that's the circle tubing where the wheel pivots on. So this will go in like this. Then you'll drop the washers and the nut on top. Then as you turn the wrench or you use a socket, this area here is going to shorten the distance, and so it's going to force the bearing to come up and be unseated. So this piece of equipment right here cost me about $15. However, I've used it so many times now that cost per unit is down to under 20 cents. This was a good investment. Now the next question is, how do you seat the new bearing? I understand that hydraulic presses cost money. I built one using wood and a bottle jack that I modeled to work upside down. You don't need that fancy of an option, however. What you can use is called an H-clamp. So, you buy the orange ends in a package at your big box hardware store, and then the tubing in the middle, it's sold separately in around the products that deal with natural gas in the plumbing department. This cost me about $30 for the orange metal, and then about $8 for this piece here. Now the final component of this is a little pusher that you'll use to seat the bearing. What I used for my pusher was a cutoff length that the store just gave me because someone needed to trim, their length of pipe, and the store cut it off and put it in the freebie bin. The way this works is this goes at the bottom, and this goes over top of the stem bearing housing, and then the little pusher will seat in the middle, and it's tight against the bearing that you're putting in. And then with a few turns of the knob, what you're doing is shortening the distance, and that's pushing the bearing into place. You'd be amazed the amount of pressure that's exerted with each turn. So it's plausible to use an H-clamp when you're changing a bearing, and this does work. I've done both the press method and the H-clamp method. I don't have a preference one over another. It's what's most practical in the moment. Your backup option for this is an automotive store. It takes 2 minutes to seat a bearing if you're able to bring the stem bearing housing to them to do it. I do need to remind you that once you've done this once, it's like an old shoe that fits perfectly or a glove that your hand just goes into smoothly. You'll gain confidence with experience. So there's one more part that I want to talk about with bearing maintenance. If you're traveling out of town with your wheelchair, you could potentially have some caster flutter or something else break down where you're not ready and able to address it yourself. Before you leave home, get the contact details of a mobility store in the city where you're going, so if you do have a breakdown, you can reach out to them for help. Wheelchair motors with brushes need periodic replacing so that the wheelchair is able to maintain the highest speed that is indicated in its literature. Now, when a brush is starting to wear out, it's kind of deceptive. There's not an immediate warning sign that it's doing this. Instead, it gradually slows down. So what you will notice is, I remember back when the wheelchair was going this fast, now it's only going this fast on a level surface. And that would be when you would mail order or purchase from your local mobility store the kit that contains the brushes for your specific motor. You need to know your wheelchair make and model, the motor make and model, the motor's serial number, and the month and date when the motor was purchased. Why you need to know all these details is periodically motors are tweaked and you need to replace the brushes with a different model. It was upgraded from the previous motor model. So you want to make sure that when you're planning for maintenance, it's the right parts that you're asking for. So a lot of the time, a serial number is used as a point of reference. As you begin to do maintenance on your wheelchair, page 1 of your maintenance journal should contain a list of the wheelchair parts and where you're sourcing them, as well as serial numbers to go with them for future planning. It's just going to make it that much less stressful when your wheelchair breaks down and you're able to continue on with your quality of life as best as possible. Planning ahead does help. It's being proactive instead of reacting to the situation. So, replacing a motor brush is common to the carpentry industry. I'll give you an example. Some chop saws that you go like this to cut wood have brushes in them. So if there's someone in your neighborhood that's handy, they might be able to handle the task if you brought them the instructions that you could find on the internet for how to do it for your make model of motors. This may be something that you want to go to the mobility store for. You need to be honest with yourself or the person that's doing this for you on what their skill set is and when they need to say, no, this is something you need to pay for. And quite frankly, with the few times that a motor brush needs to be replaced, it wouldn't be that big of a hardship to hire it out. And maybe you could think about it in terms of averages. If you take on the responsibility for taking care of the replacement tubes and tires for your wheelchair and also doing the bearings, then only hire the motor brushes. Well, if you spread that cost of labor out considering everything else that you're taking care of, it's not that big of a burden. You know, I've worked out that my wheelchair needs $10 a month in maintenance to keep it at the new state. So, the wheelchair is not always going to break down each month, but if I take that $10 and set it aside in a separate bank account that I've got labeled disability, then the money is there for when it's needed. There's a lot of relationships with the mobility store that are reactive. My wheelchair's broke down, when can you get here? If you do your own maintenance, you can start to see patterns evolving when you keep track of how much you use it each day. Like I drove 2 kilometers or 1.5 miles. You'll be able to see that after so many miles or kilometers, the rear left bearing needs to be replaced, or the small tires need to be replaced every how many hundred of miles or kilometers. It's the same thing with batteries. After this many days I see, or after this many of kilometers, I see that the batteries get to where they aren't holding a charge and it's time to start over again. By the way, you can refurbish lead acid batteries with something called a Bedini charger. Look it up. It's worth your while. Another tip about wheelchair batteries is you can buy them at the big box hardware store. So it's not like you're stuck. There are options besides the mobility store with many parts. because wheelchairs nowadays are bringing parts together. The box that houses everything and the wheels are bolted on, that's proprietary. But bearings, you might see them used in a wheelbarrow as well as your wheelchair. They're not specific for your wheelchair, or a lot of the times it's not specific. I don't want to blanket statement this, but there is a lot of overlap where you can think of other applications where these things are being used. The final topic for this video is item number 5, the frame of the wheelchair's maintenance. So I can see 3 scenarios where it needs to be maintained. The first is with the forks. So the forks are the piece of metal with the bolt welded to it that the little wheels at the front and back use to turn corners left or right. So what goes on with them is if you do a lot of outdoor driving, you're just pounding them into the asphalt or cement roadways, it can wear the threads down on the bolt that points up. And I need to recommend that you would buy forks that are made specific to your make, model of wheelchair. You know, I've seen used parts online. If you do a search for it, this potentially is a part that could be taken off one wheelchair and used in another, as long as it's straight again, or else you could buy a set of 4. This isn't a part that I would go back to a fabricating shop to have custom made. When your wheelchair was originally created, it was engineered and there was a plan for the amount of stress that would be put through each of the little wheels. If you go and replace it with a part that's cheaper but the same, it may not have the same quality of metal. There are, even though there's different steel, even though it's all steel, there's different strengths of it. The same with aluminum and titanium, there's different grades. So it's one thing that I would not cheap out, and if you're going to do it, it's on you when you hurt yourself because of the part snapping or breaking. You need to know what you're doing with this and being responsible in your decision making. The next area is using thread locker to seal the bolts. So the way thread locker works is it's put on the threads, maybe the last 3, just a little line like you were taking a marker, and then as the bolt and nut go together, when there's an airtight environment, the chemical in the thread locker activates and it seals. There's different styles of thread locking fluid. I only own removable. Permanent thread locker takes a high temperature to break the bond. I personally don't have any need for high strength thread locker in the maintenance that I coordinate for my power wheelchair. You could get yourself in a real situation that's going to be hard to resolve if you use permanent when removable was required. So I only keep the removable kind. So if you were taking responsibility of your wheelchair, using thread locker on all the bolts prevents rust from happening. Rust cannot take place when there's not air. So with that knowledge that thread locker seals and activates in an airtight environment, what you're doing is making your wheelchair easier to maintain as time goes on. Give that some thought. The final part of this, I kind of find it fun. When you see rust showing up on your wheelchair, maybe it's where the armrest goes down into its holder. That's one spot that tends to vibrate as you're going down the street. Another might be seeing a little rust forming on bolts. Take care of it as it's happening. That's getting some knowledge about how paints work and spray painting what's necessary. I ask questions to the paint department staff of the big box store near my home because I don't know everything. That's how you learn to do, is asking questions. And if you can acknowledge that you don't know everything, you can get what you need to make an informed decision to help yourself. I think it's worth taking care of the frame of your wheelchair. To me, you see cars on the road that are old. Even if a wheelchair is old, you'll know it as being dependable, and maybe it doesn't need to be wrote off, especially if it's on you to come up with the money for the next wheelchair. I've heard of people buying scooters when they genuinely need a wheelchair but don't have the money because of how much they are up front compared to a scooter being several $1,000s less. It's a situation where if you take care of it, it can last longer. It goes above and beyond and not being in the thought pattern of this is going to last for 5 years. It's planning to take care of it with the same compassion and passion that an old car, like a model car, like Model T, is taken care of to exist in our time when the Model Ts were from back here. So, in my opinion, a worn-out wheelchair is one where the frame has been bent. That's to say, it got hit hard into the curb, or when you were out shopping, or basically when you lost control of the wheelchair. If the frame is off square, the stresses that are put on it were not planned maybe, or planned for at the time of engineering. It means the wheelchair is going to wear and wear out differently. Once it's off square, it's a headache like you may have experienced with a car after it had been in an accident. When a vehicle's in an accident, it's commonly said that it wasn't the same ever again. So I want to ask you to think about this. If you can't control your wheelchair, I strongly feel you should not be using it, and instead having one that you can either do with your hands, take some more training, or there is the option of an attendant joystick. So that's a second joystick that's not bolted to the wheelchair frame, but one that someone could hold and control the wheelchair while they took you out for a ride. I'm not trying to hurt your feelings in saying this, but this is a powerful instrument. You can be very seriously hurt if you do not know what you're doing and do not operate it safely. Ask for help if you need it. An occupational therapist is the point of contact when it comes to the wheelchairs and the training. Alternatively, if you're connected with a mobility store, asking for a few pointers is reasonable if they were the store that did the sale. Alternatively, you could pay an hourly rate to have them come and spend some time with you over the safe operation of the wheelchair and addressing what you're struggling with. I had to demonstrate competency in operating this wheelchair before it was given to me. I want to make sure that you understand what's reasonable and that you're willing to ask for help when it's needed. So being off square is a situation when I would consider a wheelchair as worn out. Now, the definition that the program that paid for my wheelchair use was beyond economical feasibility for replacing it, meaning it would cost so much that it's better to start over. If you're taking care of the maintenance yourself, it's really not all that expensive. And I could see a wheelchair lasting a lot longer if the owner or the owner's friend is taking care of the maintenance instead of paying so much money per hour for a mobility store or an independent contractor to take care of the wheelchair. Finally, I want to share with you a dirty little secret that I learned about the industry. I found out that there are some service technicians that default to replacing parts instead of diagnosing a problem. If it's in your gut that something's not sitting right with you, start asking questions or start asking for a second opinion so that you can make sure that you're satisfied that what's being said to you is right. I know the wheelchair I use so well that it becomes an extension of my body. So I get a fairly strong inkling if someone's trying to pull the wool over my eyes, and I don't stand up for it. I do speak up for myself. I do not like being lied to. And sometimes you need to speak up for yourself because otherwise you become just a number. It's important when you're dealing with a mobility store that they understand your lifestyle so that they can help you be effective. When you're going on your own, you have to have that confidence of the model been established and how you're going to use it so it serves you well. And it is something to think about. I'm not trying to get you to sway one way or another. I'm just trying to give you the facts of what I've learned and how to do it. And one of the practical applications I found was cleaning a caster fork and changing a $2 bearing resolved the shaking, where the mobility store was talking about replacing a whole arm assembly. $2 part compared to $800. To me, the $2 part wins. The only downside to taking on the responsibility of your wheelchair maintenance that I can see is that you don't have access to the resources of a mobility store. So you need to have your own plan B of how you're going to respond as your wheelchair needs maintenance. Maybe you could go ahead and buy a used wheelchair that's manual, like with the wheels, so that when your power wheelchair breaks down, you're not stuck until maintenance is able to happen. It's about planning ahead so you're not stressed out in the situation of when you do need to arrange for repairs. In my opinion, the fee times something needs to be done that a friend can't do it could be hard to handle. So you need to make sure if you're having a friend do it, what their availability is going to be. If they're on vacation or away for work, you need to make sure that you have a plan in place for how you're going to manage this. It is a lot of responsibility. I don't want to lie to you. But at the same time, it's rewarding when you see what you've done and how it's contributing to your quality of life. So I know I've gone over a lot in this video. I encourage you to mull it over and not make a decision in the moment of how you're going to respond. I even encourage you to watch this video a second time in a few days from now and catch other points that you may have missed or got thinking about the next point that I was talking about. And if you're going to approach someone to take care of your maintenance with you, maybe you could sit down and watch this together and then have a frank, open, and honest discussion about what the skill set is and set the boundaries on how someone can help you and when they can't. And it's important because that avoids conflict. It's a little bit of prevention and planning that will pay off in dividends in the long run. So you can obviously tell this is something I'm passionate about. As I take care of the wheelchair, it's given me a great quality of life. I enjoy it. I find it very rewarding using my hands. It's something that I'm glad I've got. The alternative was becoming housebound at 33 years old. And believe you me, I've got too much zeal for life to allow this to happen. This is an asset, not a liability. It takes a while to get used to it. Things aren't the same as they once were, but it's okay because you're still able to live and enjoy life. Thank you so much for this time that you spent with me today. I do greatly appreciate it. I enjoy making these videos for you. Have a wonderful night. God bless. Bye for now.